"You're fired. Pack your things." Marcus Sterling's voice cut through the cardiac wing like a blade as he pointed at the black nurse adjusting an IV drip. 43 staff members froze in the corridor of Sterling Memorial Hospital, the $700 million facility he'd built and named after himself. Nurse Amara Wells didn't flinch, didn't argue. She simply finished securing the patient's line with the steady precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Sterling's jaw tightened at her composure. What he didn't know, the elevator behind him was about to open, and the man stepping out was about to destroy everything Marcus Sterling thought he understood about the woman in scrubs. 3 years earlier, Amara Wells walked through the gleaming front entrance of Sterling Memorial for the first time. The lobby alone made her pause. Italian travertine floors, a 40-foot living wall of orchids misted by a hidden irrigation system, a Steinway concert grand played every weekday morning by a pianist on retainer. Her sensible black flats made almost no sound on the polished stone. She carried a small leather satchel and wore plain navy scrubs under a thin gray cardigan. Most people who looked at her saw exactly what Sterling Memorial's branding wanted them to see: another floor nurse, replaceable, invisible, useful but unimportant. Almost nobody knew that Amara Wells held a medical degree from Johns Hopkins. Almost nobody knew she'd completed a cardiothoracic surgery fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic at 31, becoming one of only 47 black female cardiothoracic surgeons in the entire country. And almost nobody knew why a woman with those credentials was clocking in as a registered nurse on the cardiac floor of a private hospital where the CEO didn't bother learning the names of his clinical staff. The reason was simple, and Amara never explained it to anyone who didn't need to know. Her younger sister Jasmine had been admitted to Sterling Memorial 18 months earlier with chest pain that wouldn't ease. The cardiology team had dismissed her as anxious, sent her home with a prescription for Xanax and a referral to a therapist. Jasmine collapsed in her kitchen 6 days later from an undiagnosed aortic dissection. She'd been 29 years old. Married 7 months. Trying for a baby. The internal investigation Sterling Memorial conducted on its own behalf concluded that no errors had been made. Amara had read the report 3 times. She'd read the chart notes 4 times, and she'd known with the clinical certainty of a surgeon who'd repaired aortic dissections with her own hands that her sister had been failed by a system that didn't take a black woman's pain seriously. She also knew that the only way to understand a hospital from the inside was to work inside it. So she'd taken a leave from her surgical practice, accepted a nursing position under her maiden name, Wells, not Dr. Bennett Wells, and started watching, listening, documenting, waiting for the patterns she suspected to surface. Marcus Sterling built his empire from sharp elbows and sharper instincts. Son of a Connecticut hedge fund family, Horton Emba, 23 years in healthcare administration before he'd cobbled together enough investors to launch Sterling Memorial as a premium concierge medical experience. He'd flipped 2 community hospitals before this one, stripping unprofitable services, raising prices, marketing to wealthy patients who could afford to pay out of pocket for proximity to billionaires in adjoining suites. Forbes had profiled him last year. Net worth, $412 million. 3 homes, including a glass-walled penthouse on Park Avenue. A yacht docked in Newport. A wife 20 years his junior, and an ex-wife who hadn't spoken to him since the settlement. Sterling treated his hospital the way he treated his portfolio. Numbers mattered. People who produced numbers mattered. People who didn't were liquidated. Every quarter he walked the floors with a clipboard, watching, scoring, making decisions about who stayed and who didn't based on what he called operational efficiency metrics. The nurses called these walks the raping. The doctors made themselves scarce on those days. Sterling didn't notice they were avoiding him. He thought they were busy. Every morning at 6:45, Amara passed Sterling in the executive corridor on her way to the cardiac wing. He never looked up from his phone. Twice she'd held the elevator for him. Both times he'd stepped in without a glance, without a word, and pressed his floor button as if she weren't there. To Marcus Sterling, the woman in navy scrubs was furniture. To Amara Wells, Marcus Sterling was a man who'd built a beautiful machine that was quietly killing women who looked like her. She recognized the type. She'd seen it before. Every Wednesday at 11:00 sharp, Sterling walked the cardiac wing with his clipboard. Amara had clocked his pattern within her first month. He moved fast through corridors, pausing at nurse stations to read response times off the digital boards, never speaking to patients, never asking clinical questions, never noticing when an IV bag was low or when a heart monitor showed a concerning rhythm. He noticed only what could be measured by a stopwatch and a spreadsheet. Twice he'd passed within 3 feet of Amara as she sat with a frightened elderly woman whose husband had just died on the table. Both times Sterling's eyes registered her, classified her, dismissed her. Just another nurse. He never broke stride. But something else was happening on the cardiac floor that Sterling's clipboard couldn't measure. 3 patients in 7 weeks had been discharged with what their charts called non-cardiac chest pain, and 2 of them had returned to the emergency room within 10 days. 1 died. The other survived only because a surgeon at a different hospital had recognized the dissection his Sterling Memorial doctor had missed. Amara pulled both charts during her night shifts, using credentials she'd legitimately earned and access she'd legitimately been granted. Both patients were black women under 40. Both had presented with classic atypical symptoms. Both had been seen by the same attending cardiologist, Dr. Preston Hale, the same physician who discharged Jasmine. Amara photographed the records on her personal phone, stored them in an encrypted folder her lawyer had set up, and added 2 more names to a list that was now 11 names long. She didn't share what she had. Not yet. She was building something that couldn't be dismissed. Then came the morning that broke the pattern. A new patient arrived in the cardiac wing at 6:14 a.m., a 46-year-old black woman named Denise Carter who'd been transferred from the ER overnight with what her chart called atypical chest discomfort, low cardiac risk. Amara took report from the night nurse and walked into Denise's room with the morning vitals. Denise was awake, sweating. Her color was wrong, a gray undertone under the dark of her skin that any first-year medical student should have flagged. Her blood pressure was 20 points lower than it had been 4 hours ago. She told Amara, in a tight voice, that the pain had moved into her back. Amara's hands didn't tremble, but something inside her did. Tearing chest pain. Migrating to the back. Hypotension. A black woman in her 40s. It was the same constellation that had killed Jasmine. And Dr. Preston Hale, who was on call that morning, had already signed off on a stable for discharge note based on overnight labs. Amara stepped into the hallway and pulled up the cardiac imaging schedule on the computer. The next available CT angiogram slot was at 1:30 p.m. 7 hours away. She walked directly to Dr. Hale's office. He was on his phone, feet up on his desk, laughing at something his golf partner had just said. She told him, professionally and clearly, that Mrs. Carter's presentation was concerning for aortic dissection and that she needed imaging now. Hale waved her off without lowering the phone. Her troponins were negative twice. She's anxious. Give her something for the anxiety and let her go home. Amara didn't move. She told him, more firmly, that the patient's symptoms had progressed and that her vital signs had changed in the last hour. Hale finally lowered the phone. "Nurse," he said, with a smile that wasn't friendly, "do you have a medical degree I'm not aware of?" Amara held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. She thought about Jasmine. She thought about the 11 names in the encrypted folder. Then she said, quietly, Order the CT. Dr. Hale. Please. He laughed and went back to his call. That was when Amara made the decision that would detonate 3 years of patient waiting. She walked back to the nurse's station, picked up the phone, and called the radiology department directly. She invoked a rapid response, a designation that any nurse can call when she believes a patient is in immediate danger. Within 4 minutes, a radiology tech was wheeling Denise Carter toward the CT scanner. Within 12 minutes, the scan was complete. Within 14 minutes, the on-call radiologist was calling the cardiac wing in a voice that had lost all of its professional calm. Type A aortic dissection, extending from the aortic root into the descending thoracic aorta. The patient needed an emergency surgical consult within the next 30 minutes, or she would die on the gurney. Amara was already moving. She paged the cardiothoracic surgery team. She called the OR to begin preparing a room. She returned to Denise's bedside, took her hand, and told her, in the calm voice she'd used 100 times in her own operating room, that everything was going to be okay, but they had to move quickly. Denise's husband had just arrived in the corridor. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a charcoal suit, hospital ID clipped to his lapel. The kind of presence that filled a doorway. He stopped when he saw his wife being transferred to a gurney. His face changed. He looked at Amara, and Amara, who in 3 years had been very careful never to be recognized, saw him truly see her for the first time. Because Denise Carter's husband was Dr. Elias Bennett, chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Sterling Memorial, and Amara Wells's husband of 9 years. It was at exactly this moment that Marcus Sterling walked onto the cardiac floor with his Wednesday clipboard. He saw, in sequence, a patient on a gurney being rushed toward the elevator, a nurse he didn't recognize moving with urgency that didn't appear scheduled on his efficiency dashboard, a code blue level commotion that should not have been happening on the most expensive floor of his hospital, and Dr. Elias Bennett, his star surgeon, the physician whose name brought wealthy patients to Sterling Memorial from 3 states, standing in the corridor, looking at a black floor nurse with an expression Sterling couldn't read. Sterling did what Sterling always did when something happened that he didn't understand. He took control. He strode forward, clipboard raised, and asked, in the loud voice he used to remind everyone whose name was on the building, what the hell was going on in his cardiac wing. Amara turned to face him. She was still holding the patient's chart in one hand and Denise's hand in the other. Her tone was even. Mr. Sterling, this patient is being transferred to the or for emergency surgical repair of a type A aortic dissection. Dr. Hale missed the diagnosis. I invoked a rapid response. The on-call radiology team confirmed. I need to escort the patient to pre-op. Sterling's face flushed. He didn't hear medical information. He heard insubordination. He heard a nurse contradicting one of his attending physicians in front of 40 witnesses on a Wednesday, on his floor in his building. He looked at her badge. Wells. He didn't know the name. He didn't know the woman. He didn't know the patient. He didn't know that the man standing 6 feet behind him was watching his every word with a stillness that should have warned a more careful man. "What's your name?" Sterling demanded. "Amara Wells, Earn. How long have you worked here?" 3 years. 3 years, and you think you can override a board-certified cardiologist's clinical judgment because you have a hunch? His voice was rising now. Heads were turning. He was performing. Sterling knew, on some level, that he was making a scene, but he believed, the way men like him always believed, that the scene would end with everyone learning the lesson he was teaching. He took 2 steps closer to her. "You know what your job is? Your job is to be fast and quiet and do what the doctors tell you. That is your entire job. And you have spent the last 20 minutes being the slowest, loudest, most arrogant nurse on this floor. You're done. Do you understand me? You're fired." Right now. For being too slow to do your actual job, which is to follow orders, and for being arrogant enough to think you know more than a doctor. He turned to the charge nurse, who'd gone the color of paper. Walk her out. Now. That was when the corridor went silent. Because Dr. Elias Bennett, chief of cardiothoracic surgery, the most decorated surgeon on Sterling Memorial's staff, took 2 steps forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He looked at his wife. Then he looked at his other wife on the gurney. Then he looked at Marcus Sterling. And in a tone that was quiet but carried the unmistakable authority of a man who'd cracked open more chests than Sterling had read board minutes, he said, "Mr. Sterling. That's my wife." The surgeon. Sterling actually swayed, as if the floor had moved beneath him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Amara, he looked at Bennett, he looked at the chart in Amara's hands. He looked back at Amara. The silence in the corridor was so complete that the soft beeping of a heart monitor 3 rooms away was audible. The charge nurse had stopped breathing. One of the residents had quietly raised a phone and was now filming. Bennett continued, in the same level tone. Dr. Amara Bennett Wells, cardiothoracic surgeon. Johns Hopkins Cleveland Clinic Fellowship, board certified for 9 years. She has performed 247 aortic dissection repairs at 3 different academic medical centers. Her 1-year survival rate is the highest in her cohort. She has been working at this hospital as a registered nurse under her maiden name for reasons that are about to become extremely relevant to a federal investigation, and she just saved my wife's life. The patient on that gurney is my second wife. My first wife was Amara's sister. She died in this hospital 18 months ago, in a bed 60 feet from where you are currently standing. He paused. You just fired the only surgeon in this building who has ever correctly diagnosed an aortic dissection in a black female patient on the first attempt, including me. Sterling's hand drifted up to his collar. His face had gone past red into a mottled gray. He tried to speak. Bennett held up a hand to stop him. There's more, Bennett said. Amara has been documenting the cardiac wing's diagnostic patterns for 3 years. She has 31 cases, 11 deaths, 7 survivors who suffered preventable complications. Every single one was a Black or Latina woman under 50. Every single one was discharged or downgraded by Dr. Preston Hale, the cardiologist you just defended in front of 40 witnesses. Every single one had a presentation consistent with the kind of cardiac emergency that requires immediate imaging and immediate surgical consultation. Every single one was sent home with a prescription for an anti-anxiety medication. He took a slow breath. The dossier is currently with the Joint Commission, the State Medical Board, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the FBI's Civil Rights Division. They've been building the case for 8 months. They were planning to execute it next Tuesday. But I think today might be a better day. He turned slightly. Amara was already moving toward the elevator with the gurney. Denise Carter, Bennett's second wife, whom Amara had loved like a sister for the 4 years of their marriage, reached up from the gurney and squeezed Amara's hand. Amara squeezed back. Bennett caught his wife's eye for 1/2 second of pure clinical communication. I will scrub in. You take her up. We have her. And then the elevator doors closed. Sterling was still standing in the corridor. The charge nurse had stepped away from him as if he were radioactive. 2 of the cardiologists who'd come out of their offices to watch were now murmuring to each other, and one of them was already on his phone. Dr. Preston Hale, who had stepped into the hallway a minute earlier, had gone the color of old paper and was backing slowly toward his office. Bennett looked at Sterling for one long, considering moment. You should sit down, Marcus, he said, almost gently. I'd recommend you have your attorney meet you in your office. You're going to need one. He turned and walked toward the oar. He had a wife in surgery. He had to scrub in. By the time the surgery ended 6 hours later, Denise Carter survived, repair successful, prognosis excellent. The federal investigation had officially commenced. 2 FBI agents arrived at Sterling Memorial that evening with a search warrant for the cardiology department's records spanning the last 5 years. Dr. Preston Hale was placed on administrative leave, and his medical license was provisionally suspended within 72 hours pending review. The Joint Commission issued an emergency notice flagging Sterling Memorial for systemic patient safety failures, including suspected Title VI civil rights violations in the provision of medical care. The State Attorney General's office opened a parallel inquiry within 5 days. Marcus Sterling himself was named in 3 separate filings within 10 days. A federal civil rights complaint alleging knowing tolerance of discriminatory medical care, a state-level investigation into concealment of patient harm, and a private wrongful death lawsuit brought collectively by the families of the 11 women who had died on his watch. The video shot by the resident in the corridor that morning, Sterling pointing at a black nurse and firing her for being too slow while a stretcher carrying a dying black woman rolled past behind him, reached 18 million views on its first day online. By the second day, 3 of Sterling Memorial's largest insurance contracts had been suspended pending review. By the end of the first week, the hospital's board met in emergency session and voted unanimously on the recommendation of outside counsel to remove Sterling as CEO. His name came off the building within 90 days. The new name, chosen after consultation with the families of the patients who'd been harmed, was Jasmine Wells Memorial Hospital. Sterling settled the civil cases for an undisclosed sum that was widely reported to be in the high 8 figures. He sold the Newport yacht. He sold the Park Avenue penthouse. He moved to a gated community outside Naples, Florida, and was not seen at any healthcare event in the country again. Preston Hale surrendered his medical license rather than face the state board hearing. The U.S. Attorney's Office indicted him on 6 counts of felony patient abandonment and 1 count of healthcare fraud 6 months later. 8 months after the morning Marcus Sterling tried to fire her, Dr. Amara Bennett Wells walked through the front entrance of Jasmine Wells Memorial in a white coat instead of navy scrubs. The orchid wall was still there. The Steinway was gone, replaced by a quiet reading lounge for patient families and a small library of children's books for the families of pediatric patients. The new CEO, a hospital administrator with 30 years of clinical background, hired by a reformed board after a national search, had asked Amara to serve as the inaugural chair of a new patient safety and equity initiative. She'd accepted on the condition that the program have real funding, real teeth, and the authority to halt any clinical decision that fit a pattern the data had flagged. She still operated 3 days a week. She still walked the cardiac wing on Wednesday mornings. Her sister Jasmine's photograph hung in the main lobby alongside a brief account of what had been done in her name and what was being done now in her memory, so that other women's sisters would not be sent home with prescriptions for anxiety when their aortas were tearing apart. Below the photograph, a small inscription read simply, "She came here for help. We failed her. We are rebuilding this place so that no one else's sister will be failed in the same way. This is a promise." Denise Carter, Elias Bennett's wife, the federal prosecutor whose life Amara had saved, had returned to work 3 months after her surgery and was now consulting, in an unpaid advisory capacity, with the Department of Justice on the broader federal investigation into for-profit hospital networks. She and Amara met for coffee every Friday morning. The 2 women had become something stronger than sisters-in-law. They'd become co-conspirators in the slow, careful work of changing what medicine looked like for women who looked like them. Every Wednesday at 11 sharp, Amara walked the cardiac wing herself. Not with a clipboard, with a stethoscope. She paused at every patient's door. She learned their names. She asked the nurses what they were seeing. She listened to what they said and to what they didn't say. She knew, the way only someone who'd been invisible in Scrubs could know, how much information walked through these hallways every day in the bodies of people no one bothered to look at. In the corner of the wing, near the elevator where Marcus Sterling had once tried to fire her in front of 43 witnesses, a small bronze plaque had been mounted at eye level. It read, "Every patient is somebody's sister. Every nurse is somebody. Pay attention." Amara passed it every shift. She always touched it once, lightly, with 2 fingers, the way her grandmother had touched the doorframe of the family Bible. And then she went back to work, in the building that had finally, at terrible cost, learned her name.